Hello, welcome to Genesis Origo. Let me introduce myself. My name is Lau Chin An. I'm the director of Genesis Origo, and this series we're going to look at cost and management accounting. Today we are going to look at a topic on cost classification and cost behavior. So if you're ready, then we will go straight into our notes, and I would like to explain a couple of key important things about cost classification and cost behavior. We are looking at cost classification today. So why is cost classification important and what is cost behavior? That's what we're going to do for this session. Now, the reason why we need to know how to classify costs is because we need it for communication and reporting. See, when you do not classify costs according to certain specific ways, then it will be very difficult for you to convey or to report about something to the stakeholders or basically to the users. Now, for example, if you want to tell shareholders whether you are making profit or not, then it's important that we know what kind of cost will be more meaningful to them. And if let's say you want to let managers to decide whether or not how they should control their costs, then you also need to know how to classify the cost properly. Now, because this is a very basic level that we're going to begin with, before we actually dive very deep, let us start with something quite straight to the point, quite simple. Now, let's just look at these two products that I put on the screen for you. Now, one obviously is a burger, the other one is a chair, it's an office chair. Now, let me ask you a question. So let us think from the point of view that if, let's say, you're going to buy this product, you're a customer right now. Now, how much do you think that the cost of the burger is going to be, or how much do you think the cost of the chair is going to be? Now, this is not about accuracy. It does not really matter. Okay? Now, so if you're going to go to McDonald's and you're going to buy this burger, now let's say the burger might cost you $10. Okay? Now, and let's say if you're going to go to a furniture shop and you're going to buy this office chair, probably, let's say it's going to cost you, for example, $150. All right? So it does not matter whether the amount is reasonable or not. Okay. Now, obviously, when somebody sell this product to you, that person will have to make what? Think about that. The person will need to make profit. Okay? The arrow is too thick. Let me just adjust this for a while. Okay, that's better. Now, obviously, a person or the business will need to make profit. All right. Okay, let's just call this as profit. Now, and what will the balance be? Now, if one element is supposed to be the profit of the business, what will be the other elements be? Now, obviously, it will have to be costs. All right. So what exactly refers to costs? Costs are the amount or the expenditure that you spend to run your business, to make your product, and it's important that we must know how we should classify the cost properly. Okay, now so come back to this. So this is a profit and a cost. Now, but because it's actually important that we know that this is the profit and cost that is associated with the product, so we would usually have to label it appropriately. For example, this cost that we're talking about is the cost of this product. So we will say that, okay, that is a product cost. Okay, that's a product cost. Now, and then obviously when you sell a particular product and then you say, okay, the cost is probably, let's say, now let's just put an amount for it. Let's say the amount is $110. And then you start to say, okay, so the profit is going to be $40, right? Now, that is not going to be the profit for the business, but this is only the profit that you will get from selling this chair. Okay, this is the profit that you're going to get from selling this chair. So normally from business or from accounting point of view, we would like to call this profit as a gross profit. Okay, now why call gross? Because after your gross profit, you will have a lot more expenses that you have in running your business, then you will come to the net profit. Now, because accounting world is actually very complicated, because as you go deeper and deeper and deeper inside the world of accounting, you will realize that we have different level of complexity for us to report a figure, so that even the way how we define profits can be very different. All right, but let's just not make things very complicated. Let's start with something very simple at the moment. So we just understand, okay, imagine that this is the products that we're having. So to make these products, it's going to cost me 110. Now we got to ask ourselves to switch from a position that if you are not the customer, but if you are the manufacturer, let's say you are the factory. So I want you to imagine, okay, that you are the manufacturer, that you will be producing the chair. Okay, now let's think about what kind of costs that will be attributable to this chair. So where and how that these costs will be categorized. Think about that. Okay, now so you look at the picture. Now I'm sure you would say, oh yeah, I see some plastics, some wheel, you know, the fabrics. Now you know that these are all the materials. So a product that you make will often comes with materials that is used to make the product. So we have material costs. Now obviously you can't have the chair to be there on its own, right? So you probably need to have people. You might need to have people that is involved directly to make the chair. Now if you're talking about many years ago, before we look into situations with robotics, with automation, where business environment is still very old-fashioned, it's still very labor intensive, where people will actually, for example, when I was a kid, I actually worked in this kind of environment before. You know, I'm child labor, all right? So those days, so what happened is I actually had this short holiday work where I went to this furniture's business, where what I did was I screw the wheel onto the chair. All right, so we just screw the wheel, and those days we're very naughty, so what we do is we want to screw as many wheels as possible. So to fasten in the screw as fast as we can, we will not finish off the work. We just like twist it in a little bit, and then if it's there, that's it. Okay, so that is how I could speed up my work, and that's how I can make more money. And that's the reason why sometimes when people sit on the office chair, you know, after they move around, the wheel fall off. All right, so that's because those days we are so naughty. But nowadays you find that factory may not need a human to do a lot of the work, because it has all been replaced by machines. All right, but nevertheless you might need to have human worker to get involved in certain part of the manufacturing process. You agree with me, right? Okay, so you have already identified costs to do with material. You also now realize that we need people to operate and run the factory in the production. Now that is actually labor costs. Okay, now then of course I believe you would say, oh yeah, the factory will need to run on electricity. You will need to have, you know, maybe ventilation costs. You will have to pay for repair and maintenance. Maybe if you need to get a license from the authority, there will be a license fees that you need to pay. So you start to say that, yeah, actually running business is a lot more of expenses that we need to incur. Now, so that will bring us to the next thing. How do we classify costs? Now, we will first learn how to classify costs according to the type. Okay, so when we say type, now we say that costs could be direct and indirect. Okay, now how do you define what's a direct cost and what's an indirect cost? Now, direct means it goes directly to the product. And if you Google about the definition of direct cost, you would often hear people say that these are costs that are directly attributable, or you can use the word tied to, or you can charge to the specific unit of the product or even a service. Okay, so the costs that are directly attributable or tied to or charged to the specific unit of the product. Okay, now that means you can individually identify the cost. Now that's called a direct cost. Now I'm going to give you an example again. Back to the check. Now if let's say I will need to buy the parts from my supplier. Okay, I need to buy the parts from my suppliers. All right, and one of the parts that I'm going to buy will be the wheel. Okay, the wheel. And assuming that the supplier will supply me the wheel in maybe in a big box, all right, big carton or whatever. Now let's say it's going to cost me $1,000 for every 500 wheels. All right, now so you know very clearly you're going to pay $1,000 for 500 wheels. That means each of the wheel will cost me how much? Now you will be able to get a simple division, right? So 1,000 divided by 500, you're gonna get $2 per wheel. Okay, how many wheels do you see in this chair? You can look at the diagram and see, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you have 5 wheels and it's gonna cost you $10. Now we will label this $10 as a direct material cost to this chair. Now why is it so? Now the reason is because we could identify specifically and relate this cost of the wheel to each unit of the product. So you can do that. Okay, now once you can do that, then it will become a direct material cost. Okay, but you see in this chair, right, maybe at the bottom of the chair you might have to screw some you have to screw something so that you could fasten some of the parts to the chair. So you're going to actually use a lot of screws. All right, you're going to use a lot of screws. Okay, now the part when it comes to screws is the screws are such a small thing that you get a very small amount for a lot of screws. And because sometimes we may just drop the screws, you don't get exactly the number of screws. You don't buy screws by going to a supplier and say, I want to buy 100,000 pieces of screws. So they will just say, okay, we have boxes of screws, and in one box is approximately 2,000 pieces of screw in it, but we don't calculate because it's just too small. All right, and the cost of the individual screws is just so small that it makes no sense for us to measure what is the cost of the individual screw. Now, so is a screw material? Yes, it is a material. It is not labor cost. It is not an expense. It is a material. But because the cost of the screw, it's so small, and it just doesn't make any sense for us to measure and calculate how much each of these screws that will relate to the chair, so that we would just call that as an indirect material cost. Now, do you see the difference? So what is a direct cost and what's an indirect cost now? So we can say that an indirect cost as cost that is not directly identified with the specific product. Okay, so if it is not directly identified, it is not directly attributable. Now, so one way that we usually use in business to, especially to explain to bosses that they are not with accounting background, so we'll tell them, okay, direct cost is usually cost that you can straight away know how much does it cost per unit. That's a direct cost. And indirect cost is those that you can't do that. You can't directly identify how much will it cost per unit. until you make, you know, a lot of complicated calculations to work out what's the average cost of 1 unit. That's an indirect cost. So direct goes straight to the product. Okay, now because just now we just said, right, that when you make a product, normally the cost will made up of material, labor, expenses. Okay, so material, labor, expenses. Now, so we can now say that you can have material costs that are direct in nature. So that means we will call it as direct material costs. Now, you can have material that the cost is indirect in nature. So indirect material costs as well. Now, so indirectly, I think you can now guess what I'm going to tell you, right? Now, likewise for labor, you can have direct labor costs. You can also have an indirect labor costs. Now, you see, if you really make the chair, okay, like what I've just said to you just now, you might need to hire a technician or a supervisor that his job is just to stand by the machine and basically to make sure everything is all right. Okay, so just imagine that the factory is running, the machines is operating, then you've got this guy that stands there, hold his file, and then just look at the machines, and he's just going to make sure that everything is all right. Now, he does not really go involve his time in the product. Unlike, like I've told you just now, unlike in the early days, you might get people that will actually sit and deal with the product, like what I did to screw in the wheel. Now, when I screw in the wheel, now think and see, if I screw in the wheel, now I will be paid. For example, if let's say the company says that they will pay me, for instance, $30 a day, okay? And let's say the $30 is for me to work 8 hours a day. So if I'm paid $30 for 8 hours of my work, then you also can tell that every hour that I'm working, how much will the company pay me? And then you can also work out that how long will I take to screw the wheel. Now, when you do that, you will again be able to identify and measure. That means how much of my $30 will goes to the chair. Now, my time when I was a young boy, when I do the work, they don't pay me by the hours. They pay me by what we call a piece rate. Okay, piece rate. That means they pay me according to the number of wheels that I screw in, and it's a very small amount. So for example, they say that every wheel that you screw inside, you will be paid 2 cents. So if I manage to screw 5 wheels, then I'm gonna get 10 cents. So that's basically how they pay me. Now again, you see the way that they're paying me, they are able to relate how much of my labor cost goes to the product. So the costs that involved in making the chair directly is called direct labor, and obviously the wages or the salaries that I'm paying to the supervisor, that is indirect labor costs. Now you see the difference. So this is how we classify material and labor costs according to direct and indirect. Now likewise, expenses can also be direct and indirect. Okay, expenses can be direct and it can also be indirect. Now the modern environment that we are working in nowadays basically made us understand that most of the expenses that we are having are mainly indirect than direct. All right, so and expenses wise, we also will understand that not everything of the expenses will relate to the product. There are some expenses are not relating to the product. For example, I'm very sure that you will be able to relate to this idea. You know, to sell the products, I need to have advertisement. Now, when you put up an advertisement in social media, now what cost is this? Now, it is an expense. Agreed? It is an expense. It's not material, it's not labor, it is an expense. But the next thing is, what expense is this? This is a promotional cost, marketing cost. So it's nothing to do with the product. Now, so that's where we will see how costs will then further be classified or categorized into product related and non-product related. And that goes back to how I started this just now. I've told you about how when you sell a chair for $150, and now you say that there's a product cost, and now I'm introducing to you a concept called a non-production cost. Now you see that that's a lot of ways of how we define cost, right? But what is important is we just try to understand what it is now, and as we go further, we will enhance our knowledge. So you don't have to get like too overwhelmed, like, wow, there's a lot of things that I need to know. Okay, so now what I'm going to tell you is this. The way we actually group the costs is in this manner. When you have all the costs that they are direct in nature, okay, when you have all the costs that they are direct in nature, they will be grouped as one category. And then when you have all the costs that they are indirect in nature, they will be grouped as another category. Now we call this as the prime cost. Okay, we call this as a prime cost, and we call these as productions overheads. All right, so now I would like you to look at the bigger picture. Okay, so a bigger picture that we are seeing now is actually when you're looking in the business, right? So if let's say you're talking about a particular company, all right, so you have a company, and you would realize that this company, first of all their costs are divided into two categories. Okay, now they can have costs that is production related, so that's production costs, and they can have costs that they are not production related. Okay, let me just label this. There are costs that they are non-production related, so I would just label it as NPC for non-production costs. Okay, now likewise, when we talk about production costs, we've just learned, right, that these production costs can made up of elements that they are direct, and then they have indirect production costs. Okay, now we don't use the word indirect production costs in real life because it just sounds like, you know, too hard for us to even say it. So we would just use a simple term and we call it as production overheads. Okay, production overheads. Now, a non-production cost will never have direct costs. Why? Because a non-production cost has nothing to do with the product. So when something has nothing to do with the product, it will not have a direct cost. Make sense? That's why non-production can only be overheads. You follow? Now, so what are the example of all these non-production overheads? Now, the main one that I would just ask you to think about is administration costs. You know, a business will need to have people to do the human resource work. You know, we have a HR department that their job is to hire worker, their job is to provide training, their job is to keep all the, you know, the SOP. When the workers want to apply leave, they will go to the HR. That's administration. Now you will have people that's to do with administration role as well. Now all the things, the paperwork, the processing, accounting's department is also an example of non-production costs. So you see, all these are to do with administration. Now then we just said earlier that you could have things to do with selling and distribution. So these are the people that's involved with, for example, putting up advertisement, designing the brochures. Now they are all non-production related. So are you clear or not? So if I'm going to just test you what's PC, MPC, and then what's direct cost, and what kind of direct costs do we have? Material, labor, and even direct expense. Okay, and then what about the the indirect production cost is called production overheads, right? Now you basically have the idea over here. Okay, right, this diagram basically just to echo what I've just said to you just now, that overheads can be production related, can also be non-production related. You can take a look at it over here. And what some people like to use the word production and they replace it with factory overhead. Some use manufacturing overhead. Well, it's just different terminologies, synonyms. Okay, now that is the first thing that I would like to do with y'all, about how do we classify costs according to the types: material, labor, expenses, and then direct as well as indirect. Now we will proceed on to look at cost behavior in the next video. Get more resources on our lectures and our sharing and all the resources that we have here. You may want to come to our portal and sign up as a user. If you have more information, come to our website and drop in questions using our chat box. Thank you very much for your visit. Bye.